Good morning. Thank you very much, Beck. It's a pleasure to be here and an honour to open this conference on negative emissions. I mean, I guess I'm of the Liberal Party in the past, but a small L Liberal who's been an activist about climate change, I guess, since the late 80s, early 90s. When I became leader in the in 1990, I felt it was a unique opportunity to build on the credibility this country had developed in the Kyoto process, where we punched above our weight, probably ended up with a better deal as a nation than a lot of others. So it seemed like an obvious next step to advocate a substantial emissions reduction strategy, which we made part of the Fight Back package in the early 90s, calling for a 20% cut in emissions by the year 2000 off a 1990 base. It's now nearly 30 years since that, and we still don't have an emissions reduction strategy or an overarching emissions strategy or a broad-based strategy that includes negative emissions as a fundamental component of that as well. We don't have an energy policy, we don't have a climate action plan, and I'm personally quite embarrassed and feeling quite scarred by the fact that we've ended up where we are. The short-term politics has been allowed to, and both sides have been guilty of it at times, to play the short-term political game, to score points on each other, to shift blame and never deal with the problem. And even today, after the Wentworth by-election, where it was quite clear that climate action strategy was a key issue in that campaign, the government's still sticking its head in the sand. Even today, there's media reports this morning that now across all other seats, climate is emerging as the dominant issue for the next federal election. You'd think in that sort of environment they might pay attention. When you look at every poll and every survey that's been run in the recent years, there's an increasing majority each time of the broad-based electorate that want decisive action on climate change. And a very strong constituency. I think in the last Lowy survey, more than 80% of people want to facilitate a transition to renewable energy. It is staggering to me that we have ended up where we are, and so much focus really within that on just the electricity sector, which is only about a third of our emissions. And the other 2/3 are neglected, particularly transport, for example. And when you get a report like the IPCC report that came out a couple of weeks ago, which made some pretty, I think, significant statements about where we sit, we're already finding that the impact of global warming to date is greater and faster than we imagined. We've already found that the risk is now not just 1.5 degrees, but maybe 3 degrees or 4 degrees of warming and the likely consequences of that. We're starting to recognise the pace at which technology is changing this debate. It's moving very quickly, much faster than people imagined. The price of renewables have dropped faster than people imagined. The impact on, say, electric vehicles is moving very quickly. Some countries like Norway are going to ban combustion engines by 2025. I mean, these are very fast changes. And yet we have a government in this country that's sitting back and pretending that we can ignore all that, even though we are one of the highest levels of per capita emissions in the world. And I think we are the second largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world if you combine coal and LNG. So in those circumstances, I mean, conferences like this become fundamentally important to try and broaden the debate. And I know you'll get tension if you try and raise the concept of negative emissions in the concept of, in a world where they're already having a lot of trouble dealing with emissions reductions generally. But it has to be done, and it is a fundamentally important element of an overarching emissions strategy, or what I would call a climate action plan. In fact, my line in the Wentworth by-election is that if a government doesn't have a climate action plan, they forfeit the right to be a government. And I think that is a message that we're trying to get across the board. In terms of getting an understanding of negative emissions, well, it's a few years ago now, I had a debate on Radio National with somebody called Barnaby Joyce, who was the Minister for Agriculture at the time, I think, and we talked about what was described as soil carbon, using the soil to sequestrate carbon by simply changing farming techniques. Tilling of the soil, move from chemical to natural organic fertilisers and so on. And what I was trying to argue was that, look, here's a unique opportunity for the National Party to do something positive for the farming community. You can develop a structure whereby, as they improve the carbon content of their soils, they earn carbon credits, which can be bought even by the government or into some market system if we had one, which would give the farmers another income stream in addition to what they've got today. We mentioned in passing the fact that you can improve the soil's absorption capacity by that as well and minimise the intensity of droughts and so on. But that individual had no concept of this whatsoever, thought I was talking nonsense and just raised every particular objection to come to his mind quickly, and his mind's not that great. So it came to his mind and he threw it out on the table. Now, that's the world we're dealing with. Yet that same individual has a Chinese company in his electorate, Goldwind, that has a large wind farm operation. Chinese state government owned. Normally the National Party would object to something like that happening in this country. And they tell me that Barnaby badgers them all the time. Can't I come down and launch a turbine? Can't I open something? Can't I put a shovel in the ground? And when he turns up, he sings the praises of renewable energy. You know, how many jobs it's creating in his electorate around Armidale, how much investment has flowed in, and so on. And he gets on a plane, flies down to Canberra and attacks state governments who've got emissions reduction targets or transition strategies to renewables or whatever. That's the world we're operating in, unfortunately. So I think it's a challenge in terms of what's happening here today, is to take the inherent merit of some of the solutions that you're looking at, whether they're enhancing the natural processes of the soil and the oceans, or whether they're actually technological developments that will really make a difference, and try and get a better understanding of the opportunities. And to me, one of the things that's annoyed me over the years about the climate debate has been the assumption that if you make any change to where we are, it's going to be negative for growth, negative for jobs, negative for investment and so on, which is nonsense. I mean, a proper climate action strategy would see us seizing on opportunities we have as a nation. We've got an unusual endowment of wind and solar. We've got a very large land mass which can be used for everything from forestry to soil conservation. We've got a very large ocean surrounding us. We are in a unique position to lead the world in so many of these technologies and so many of these solutions. But with a lack of leadership, not just by government, but also I would say by the business community, we are losing those opportunities. I don't know how many tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of investment we've lost since the late 80s when I first got involved in this and tried to demonstrate the business opportunities that will flow from it. So I think that this is an academic conference, basically. It's a fundamentally important conference. I mean, academics are much maligned in this debate, of course. Scientists in particular have been much maligned. And I think the key point of the whole climate debate is that climate scientists have done what they don't normally do. They've actually agreed. It's the nature of science to contest each other's hypotheses, contest each other's conclusions, research conclusions. And here you've got an overwhelming body, some 90-odd percent, 95% of peer-assessed climate scientists saying this is a problem, it's a significant problem, it needs an urgent response. And in that sort of world, I mean, you have an enormous contribution to make by this sort of conference. I think this is the first of its type in this country on negative emissions. It won't be easy to elevate the issue of negative emissions, and a lot of the technologies that I'm aware of in this area are still, the line that bankers use is to be proven at scale. You know, you can demonstrate that they'll work, you can demonstrate that they have enormous potential, but you've actually got to do it at scale. And I think that's the challenge to the business community and the government, to understand that this is worth funding, that this is worth developing, and these sort of results will make a fundamental difference to the standing of this country and our response to the climate challenge. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all today and to wish you well with this conference. I think it's a very important step forward, and hopefully somebody will be listening. Thank you.